Simone here again for another awesome conversation. Today, Bella of Living Matrix, 64 Doors and Unlock Your Design, contacted John and I to have this conversation about architecture of the soul. John's in Denver, John does Awakening the Heart, and he also teaches us the dynamics of ascension science. And y'all know me as the Soul Whisperer. So today, we're going to have a conversation about the architecture of the soul. Bella, since you, this was your genius bringing us all together for this conversation, why don't you share with us today, what was your internal catalyst, your motivation?
Yeah, so I was saying to you before that it's an intuition. I just knew that I had conversations with you, Simone, about the soul, how we were also going into your design and see like why does soul speak to you? Why do you have this ability to be a soul whisperer? And then I had conversations with John, which like his quality is very different. There was like I could see, for me, the word that I got, there's an architecture of the soul. That's what I felt like. And I could see that the way that you are painting it and the way that you're, also executing it in a way, Simone, it's like it has a flavor that is very, it's like your channel is coming through you. And then when I was in a webinar with John, it's like this, the authority that I felt in that seminar, it was also connected to the soul. It was like, it felt like it was a soul. It wasn't like just a human quality. It was a soul quality. And for me, it just felt, intuition is kind of my thing. I felt like I wanted to bring it together and I wanted to start a conversation. I don't know if today's a conversation starter. I don't know if I don't really know what it is, but I feel like we're going to be able to shine light on this thing that for me, I call architecture of the soul. And I know that when we were writing the intro for the little snippet for this, live, you were already like kind of adding your things to it, why it might not be architecture of the soul, maybe it's architecture of the soul consciousness. So these are the things that I'm interested in. How can we start to speak about the soul and the geometry of the soul in ways that we can understand it and use it? And because you are the experts of this, but it happens like for each soul, right? So that's what I'm interested in, to shine some light and to maybe make it a little bit less far and make it a little bit more tangible.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous. John, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, first of all, I'm really happy to be a part of this and to be discussing this topic with both of you, because really from your introduction, Simone, the work that I do is specifically centered around, you mentioned awakening the heart. The soul aspect of our identities is where I believe the collective consciousness of humanity is expanding into. And that process is very unique for each person, but it's also a process that can appear as if we may not be making progress, quote unquote progress, the way we often look at how humanity can become better than it was. And I see that when people begin to engage with the aspect of themselves that encompasses the soul, as Bella was kind of saying, like I felt this connection to the soul from, watching the webinar or from conversations that she's had with you. There's a specific energy signature that is very recognizable that we can begin to follow, that will allow for the natural process of unfolding of the expression of this layer of our being. And especially when these aspects of ourselves begin to arise into our consciousness, especially when we've been living a 3D world where we're part of the rat race and we have to make money and pay the mortgage and like do all the things. The awareness from this aspect of our being, it seems like it doesn't fit. And oftentimes we kind of keep those aspects to ourselves because first of all, we don't know what to do with it. And second of all, oftentimes there's nowhere to share those inner thoughts because they feel too close to who we truly are at the deepest levels. And oftentimes being that intimate with another person in just a regular conversation, it feels socially uncomfortable. So in having a conversation about this with both of you, it allows for each of us to share the aspects of our own soul identities coming through us. And what that does is it generates an energetic resonance. And as that resonance grows, it allows us to amplify our own levels of expression, because that's what resonance does. When things are in harmony together, the vibration of each becomes amplified. And that causes the expansion of your own consciousness and your capability to bring forth more of all that you are. So having a conversation today about the soul and everything, I'm really excited to be a part of it, because really a huge part of my life is in assisting and encouraging others to connect with that aspect of themselves and bring it into the world, because I can only see beautiful things happening from that process.
Thank you.
I was so struck by your description of expanding into the collective consciousness, expanding into this vibration. And it really brought to me, I had a vision of Gene Key 22, and Bella's smiling because I painted Gene Key 22. I had a vision of it, and so it's a special Gene Key to me. But what I love about it, it's about, the involution and the evolution. So, us moving up into soul consciousness coming into physical embodiment. And there was a part of my painting that, I think I might even pull it up. Bella has it, but let me see if I can get it really quickly. There was a part of my painting in the vision that happened that I didn't understand. It was the very last moment after the vision occurred. This swash of golden light flew through the vision. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try my best to paint this. And I was talking to a friend of mine who Bella also knows. And I said to her, I don't understand really the yellow light that came through the vision. And she says, oh, I get that. She says, it's when the divine masculine and the divine feminine are not allowed to come in together, we dishonor the soul. And I was like, and that is, I believe, Bella, isn't dishonor the shadow frequency of the 22?
Exactly.
So when she said that, I was like, oh my, that makes perfect sense. So this process that we're going through of moving up into our soul consciousness more and more descending into the body. When we do that marriage, if you will, is the sacred honoring of body and spirit, body and soul, if you will. So, and then when we don't allow that process, it's a dishonoring of our soul consciousness. So when you were talking, that's what I was seeing geometrically as you described. So that's
beautiful, because I actually use that exact golden frequency in a great deal of the work that I do. And so I'm very, very familiar with it. That's why I started laughing when you kind of mentioned it, because, for many, it feels like decades now. I remember when I was young in the 90s, I remember becoming aware of New Age spiritual awareness, where people talked about crystals, and there was a lot of stuff going on with you know, astrology in that area, and palm reading, and a lot of the esoteric practices. And one of the spiritual lights that was focused on was the color white. And the color white has a variety of meanings from the perspective that I use. And not all of them are particularly useful in terms of what we're talking about today, this involution and evolution into the soul embodied identity. Because the white light contains all frequencies. And depending on where your frequency is, your station of consciousness, white light can attract anything and everything. And so particularly for people in the who engage in mediumship and channeling, it can be challenging to discern the types of intelligences that we are engaging with, because everything is consciousness and there are all types of consciousness in the universe. What's different about gold light is gold as a frequency itself is the frequency of sovereignty, which means a state of consciousness that is not controlled by any outside force and cannot be coerced by any outside force. So having sovereignty, just like we have with our national sovereignty, it means that we have a clear space that we occupy, and that within that space we are in absolute empowerment over what belongs there. Now, we don't always get to choose what comes in there, because sometimes there are intruders. But in general, gold is of sovereignty, and it's related to the source consciousness from which everything comes. So in terms of your painting, the involution where source consciousness is stepping down through the frequencies to come into embodiment, it reaches the layers of the soul aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And when you brought up the masculine and the feminine, part of the function of creation is through this law of gender. And when I say law of gender, I'm not referring to the sex of male and female. I'm referring to the qualities of masculine and feminine, which within our embodiments, we have plenty of both, regardless of how well we're acknowledging that. But when those two are combined, that allows for the frequency of the projection of source consciousness to be fully expressed at whatever layer of frequency that consciousness is stationed within. So when you have that unity structure of the masculine and the feminine, and this is actually expressed in the soul, in the template, as the particle and anti-particle aspects of spiritual manifestation. And when those are combined, the consciousness of source at that layer of frequency can be expressed. And you're bringing up Gene Key 22, and I was like, oh, what does that what does that have to do with? Because I'm not as familiar with all of them. So it's really interesting to see how this involution and evolution with these masculine and feminine qualities, once those are unified, to me, it creates an actual frequency of that golden sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Because when when someone is simply expressing their masculine nature or simply expressing their feminine nature, there's a requirement to go outside of the self to pull in the qualities that are not yet embodied. And that's how we end up being trapped in kind of shadow expressions, because we're looking outside.
So for Gene Key 22, I think this will even enhance what you're saying even more. The shadow is dishonor, and the gift is graciousness, and the city, the highest frequency, is grace. And so as you were talking, I was like, oh, and there it is. You know, it's just...
Yeah, I mean, I see grace as, you know, when people talk about the frequencies of different experiences, and we talk about the energy of love being of the highest frequency in the universe, the experience of grace is that receiving of that frequency. And so it's so perfect that, you know, in Gene Key 22, if you look at these masculine and feminine aspects, if you dishonor one or the other, there is no grace available, because the unification of those things can't happen. And when that unification doesn't happen, there's no channel, there's no pathway for source consciousness to come into expression through the unique aspect of being that an individuation is. And so when that unification occurs, there's an instant bestowal of grace upon that experience. And, you know, talking about that expansion of the collective, as each individual moves into that experience, grace is something that arises in your consciousness more and more.
Right. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. The more receiving, the more the container, the more the receiving, you know, and it's like, it goes back to what you were talking about at the beginning about the resonance and the harmonic. And so the more grace is allowed, then you build the harmonic just builds and builds, and the resonance builds and builds, and more grace is accessible within you, and then, you know, that spreads to the collective.
Absolutely. And, you know, if you're looking at, you know, today there's a lot of different perspectives available, especially on social media, about this spiritual structure and the roles that people are fulfilling. And when you look at some of the people who identify as light workers, as grid workers, as frequency holders, what you're describing is essentially that process where there is no doing that is required to fulfill the destiny of the soul. There's simply the beingness, because as that grace fills you up, it begins to expand beyond you without you really taking any action, because of the nature of how the soul vibration is expressed through the individual embodiment. You know, so when you come to those, like, you know, some of the people throughout history, like talking about the Buddha, why did people go to visit the Buddha? Well, they just wanted to be in his presence, right? That's why people go to see the Dalai Lama. That's why people go to see the Pope. Now, I'm not characterizing any of those people as having any amount of grace, because I don't know. I've never been around them. But there is a perception from people in the world that there can be some of that grace, you know, bestowed on them simply by being near. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a quality that, to me, it rings with my personal truth, and is an aspect of the roles that each person is engaged in that oftentimes maybe gets overlooked. You know, that presence is actually the more important aspect of our expression than what it is we actually do, and the things that we say, and how we try to change our environment to better fit the world we believe ought to be there.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
They are getting some questions like, how can, like somebody saying, I'm new to this, so how can this be achieved? So what could we make it a little bit tangible in some way to see like how, for an individual or even like in a couple, like what does this look like in our lives, and how can we bring in more of this presence and more of these energies?
Yeah, for sure. So I want to speak from a perspective of absolutes because it's easier to define. But I don't want to suggest that the absolutes are actual descriptions of anybody's experience. Almost no one is experiencing, from my perspective, almost no one is experiencing absolutes in their consciousness. We're all, because we are multi-dimensional beings working on multiple things at a time. But when we look at the layers of consciousness, one of the models that I use to understand how that functions is within a model of 12 layers of consciousness. 12 is a number that we see throughout our experiences. It's on our clocks. It's the number of months that we have. These measurements of time come from ancient wisdom. And the architecture of the soul. Now, when most people talk about their soul, they're discussing the non-physical elements that they are aware of themselves, and maybe some of the non-physical elements that they're unaware of. But from the perspective that I work with, the soul is a very specific frequency band within the consciousness of your entire being. So when we think about our physical embodiments, when we're living our lives in our 3D consciousness, we're dealing with 3 different layers of consciousness where a variety of experiences can be had at each level. And most people relate to these 3 levels as the physical embodiment, the emotional experience, and the mental experience. And when we're working with these 3 layers of our consciousness, oftentimes in our society, we have prioritized the mental body as being more accurate in terms of understanding reality. We rely on science for our perception of reality, and the emotions tend to be regarded with less ability to access the, quote, the truth that exists around us. And so that's a large reason why our society is manifested in the manner that it is, because the majority of human beings are completing our conscious expression in this mental body. We're building layers of experience within the mental body that once that is completed, we are able to shift our perspective to another layer. Now, the question was, how do we move into those other layers, right? So what is beyond the mental body is there's many different definitions, or at least labels, for these layers of our consciousness. And you'll hear it referred to as the astral body. Sometimes people will call it the etheric body. But essentially it's the aspect of self that relates to the heart space. So when we're talking about our energetic chakra system, the first, second, and third chakras do correlate to these layers of consciousness. And so the mental body is connected to the solar plexus, the emotional body is connected to the sacral chakra, and the physical etheric body is connected to the base of the tailbone, the root chakra. So consciousness is moving into the heart space. And most people would agree they have at least a concept of the idea of what is usually referred to as unconditional love. And a lot of times, unconditional love is viewed from a three-dimensional perspective, which includes a great deal of duality distortion that doesn't exist in the higher frequency of the astral body and beyond. So we see the idea of unconditional love from a perspective where there's good and bad, there's right and wrong, there's evil and benevolence. And when you look at the idea of unconditional love, the consciousness that has been modeled by some of the figureheads in religions that have spawned spiritual movements in the past, most of them in some way or form have had love as a central aspect of their message. Even many of the people today that are revered as meditation masters of peace and meditation, all of those at some point refer to the experience of love as being central to developing consciousness. And really the way to move your consciousness into an experience of what you may relate to as unconditional love, but I use the terminology divine loving presence, because it is a presence of consciousness and not an expression of something that you do, which is how we relate to it from the third dimension. Oh, this person mistreated me. I need to be more highly spiritual, so I'm going to do something nice for them in return. That's not how I perceive unconditional loving presence. So in order to transcend the duality of the first three layers of our consciousness, love must be embraced as a presence that overcomes the judgment of the duality, of the extremes. So the society, as you can see, at least in the United States, is going through a huge process of working with the frequencies around extremism. We have two political parties that are more extreme than they have ever been in the history, at least in our cultural memory. We don't remember a time when we were more polarized. Now, it doesn't mean that we weren't, but it's clearly something that our society as a collective is working through, is what is this experience of dualism and how do we move forward with it? And I would suggest that the answer to the question, how do we expand in consciousness, is to engage with these aspects of dualism that are within ourselves, that we see in the reflection outside of us. How do we engage with that within with an experience of loving presence, which essentially means when you get pissed off about the news, is it possible for you to love the aspect of yourself that is pissed off, rather than feeling that the anger that you feel in your body is the signal that you need to do something about it to change the outer environment? So that's the maybe long-winded, but best way that I can describe the movement of consciousness from where we have been for literally centuries or millennia in terms of the frequencies of consciousness that we've been working with, and where I believe the collective humanity is headed now. And, you know, one of the, Simone, what you brought up about Gene Key 22, I think it's genius, because in the last few years, our society has seen so much rise up around the relationships between men and women, around the Me Too movement, around, you know, equal rights in society. There's been so much movement around these areas of experience, and I believe it's because the majority of humans now are working through these issues. And for me, the best way to transcend these issues is to direct loving presence, whatever we can access, to ourselves, and that will allow us to begin to express that in the world in an authentic way, not a way where we're reaching after a spiritual ego to say, oh yeah, I love everybody, when you know, it's very hard to love somebody who's continually bent on injuring you for most people.
What I love about what you just described, I mean, my way of you're really talking to me about when we dishonor the self. So when the question was, how do we be, you know, how do we live more of our consciousness? How do we? So when, and the example that you gave showed of how we honor the self, that we're human, we're in these human vessels, we're having a human experience, we are going to experience the range. And it is the dishonoring, to me, comes when we are unable to acknowledge whatever it is our experience is. So if you're angry, you know, really just being with that anger in the loving presence, acknowledging it instead of pushing it down and ignoring it, like, I don't want to be this angry person, or going to the other extreme, oh, I love everyone, I forgive everyone, I'm just going to transform or transmute it. But for me, that's like a denial, a rejection, and avoiding, a pushing away of what is. And so that pushing away, for me, is what causes the fragmentation that is the dishonoring.
Mm.
And so when we can be present with whatever it is, or, you know, we are with ourselves in whatever, you know, and if we're angry, be present with that anger. Look at it, face on. And then that is what builds the self in order to receive. It's what it builds the self through the honoring of the experience.
Yeah, beautiful. Is that, I'm curious, Simone, is that, you know, from the whispering to souls, is that a message that you receive often when you're engaging with that aspect of consciousness?
Yes, and I want to give credit where credit is due. So my own personal work I've done with Dominique Sire, and she is the one who uses those words. So it's her expression of that. But it is what often comes through in soul communication when I'm working with a soul. So just briefly, so people can understand what I mean by soul whisperer, I think the gift for cloud computing is a perfect metaphor where someone's in their body, I'm in my body, and I'm able to go up to soul consciousness. So we see the little dotted line up to the cloud. And in soul consciousness, I don't know how a soul is going to talk to me. I'm quadriclarian. I don't know if I'm going to receive it in pictures or movies, or, you know, they're going to talk to me, or I'm going to feel it in my body, or just get a download. So often it's multiple ways. But so then the soul will give the message in whatever way, but it is often targeted at a place where people are fragmenting from the truth of who they are. And so when we fragment, when we can look head on, like you were saying so beautifully, when we can hold the presence, in our presence, in a loving presence of, I'm angry. And what does that feel in my body? And why am I angry? And what message is there for me? Just to really embrace that with non-judgment. That's what builds the self. That's what allows for that is the honoring of the experience with love. It is to me, the perfect expression of non-judgment, because why do we not acknowledge the anger, the fear, the shame, the guilt, whatever it is? Why is it that we dishonor ourselves and fragment? We've been taught to, some of it is lineage for whatever reason, but the more we can help people to embrace all of them and honor themselves, that's, to me, where the grace, the graciousness, the honoring, the grace comes from. So
yeah, beautiful. What that makes me think of, because I'm always when I think about what we're talking about, how do we move more of that soul consciousness into our body? I think about the experiences that we have along the way. And one of those experiences that pretty much everybody knows about is getting triggered. And so it's like, well, I got triggered. What does it mean to honor it myself when when I'm triggered? And how do I relate to the person that's doing the triggering? And the way that we are set up to experience the world, where we have these 5 physical senses that we get lots of energetic information through all the time, has really geared us to be very outwardly focused in terms of, what's happening around me and how do I need to respond to it in order to survive, in order to compete, in order to express my individuality. And for me, that description is how we experience those first 3 layers of consciousness. And what you're talking about, Simone, in the honoring, is how can we remain in presence and loving of ourselves while not rejecting the experience of our process. So, to me, when I'm thinking about it, it's like, okay, I got triggered. Does that mean I take action and start a fight because somebody triggered me? Don't I need to defend myself because I'm under attack? And when I think about honoring the experience of being triggered, of being mistreated, at least through our perception, we all know that sometimes we experience being mistreated and the person on the other side of that had no intention of being that way. But when I think about it, there is some aspect of expression that is important. Like I'm angry. How do we express that in a way that isn't just starting a fight? How can we honor our negative emotional experiences? How can we honor our anger? How can we honor our hurt? How can we honor our insult, our experience of being insulted, the wounding of our pride? How can we honor that while remaining in a state of love. And to me, it really begins with the shifting of the outward focus, which says, this person in front of me is to blame for the experience that I'm having. And I need to correct that, untruth, that mistreatment. I need to correct it, because if I don't, I'm not fulfilling the expression of my individuation. I'm not expressing the right that I have to be. I'm not expressing, how they are affecting me, right? Those are those 3 layers of consciousness. If we can make the shift from those 3 layers of consciousness, from focusing it all outward to bringing it inwards, and to say, how can I love the aspect of the trigger for causing me to recognize some energy within myself that is not in resonance with the truth of who I really am. Because that's why, when people say those sayings, like when you point at somebody, you're blaming someone, there's one finger pointed at them and there's 3 fingers pointed at you. or when people want to assign absolute responsibility to you for absolutely every experience that you have, including, like, if somebody mistreats you, that's because you haven't transcended that part of your consciousness yet. You're still being a victim. That's still a way of pointing fingers at who's to blame. Which part of us is to blame for that, like, low vibrational experience? And to me, honoring is like, it's the opposite of blame. Honoring is like elevating, of saying, wow, I honor you for making me aware of the trigger inside my experience. I honor you for showing me that there is an aspect of myself that still feels that it is unloved. Because that's what hurts when someone hurts us. When someone says something that hurts us, there's a part of us inside that is yet unloved by ourselves or by others or both. And as long as that remains, even if someone shows up in your life to love that aspect of you, you will resist it, because you have not yet turned inwards and directed that love toward yourself. And just as you were saying, Simone, as we do that, as we honor those parts by elevating them, by saying thank you for the experience, thank you, anger, for showing me that I may have made some agreements, both conscious and unconscious, with this person that don't reflect my true expression. I may have entered into relationship with a person in a way that I don't really want to support, That's what the anger is telling you, not to, like, it's not telling you, I mean, you can interpret it any way you want, but if you go spend your life punishing all the people in your experience that make you angry, it's not going to stop you from being angry at everybody. So I think that's that concept of honoring, and like how can we do that when we have those negative experiences, is really, how do we honor the person who has that opposite political view that we have, and say, how can we honor that experience, that trigger?
And where did the corruption begin? So when I'm triggered,
yeah,
that's where I go. I start backtracking within myself. First I'll say, well, self, where was the corruption within me, you know? And so I'll start kind of backtracking. And often for me, it's instead of, I said yes at a moment in the engagement where I really, in my heart, it was a no.
Right.
And for whatever reason, you know, I, in that moment, honored the other person more than I honored my own self. And eventually, you know, depending on how big the yes or the no was, you know, well, if I go back, I can, it'll directly point to the level of my triggering, right? And so it's just, for me, I learned to just go back in the engagement and find, you know, look at the truth of every moment, and I'll get to the corruption within myself. And then that's when my heart just opens up, because doing that work, instead of denying, resisting, rejecting, avoiding, being in the presence of that moment and having the courage to just say, okay, you were triggered. Let's get, you know, where's the microscope? Where's the magnifying glass? Let's look all along the way. You're going to find it. You know, I believe in you. You're going to find this. But it takes courage it takes fearlessness to go within. And yet, the more, so in that choice of going within and finding where I dishonored myself, which is the true point of corruption, which has caused the trajectory that ended up in the explosion or the triggering. When I can get back to that, instead of fragmenting, that builds the self. It makes more of my container able to receive more grace in that moment. And I see that with people I work with. The more they can receive, you know, really go within and really be with the messages that their souls are giving them, and love themselves enough to go, you know, because the soul often is going back and and pointing to some point for them. And if they can be in that point, then they have more access to the self. So it's really a beautiful kind of cycle, if you will. And then the more we build ourselves, the more courage we have, the more wherewithal we have, the more pathways that open up, that we can continually do this, go within and find that point of corruption and choose, you know, then we have the choice to choose something similar or something different. You know, it's just a constant choice.
Yeah, absolutely. I love so many points about what you brought up just in that short space. You know, being present in the moment as you're looking at how to explore a particular trigger or an explosion of negative experience or awareness. And I wanted to also kind of jump on that concept to add that as you go back and look for that moment of self-corruption where maybe you said a yes when it was really a no, I wanted to add there are also experiences that have taken place in our lifetimes that where we were in a state of unconsciousness, and maybe where we were in a state of semi-consciousness compared to how we view our everyday experience. You know, like when something happens, we think about it and then we respond. You know, that's how we view our everyday consciousness. But when we're children, we're actually in a different state of consciousness. The brain waves tend to be in the theta and alpha states quite a bit. You know, if you were ever a child that was often daydreaming and you were kind of zoning out and just like not really focusing on anything, That's an indication of your brain waves moving from that edge between a deep alpha vibration and a theta vibration. And by the way, those brain waves, alpha state is the zone, the flow state. Theta state is where we go when we're in REM sleep, when we're dreaming. So children don't have the same capacity to think and respond to events going on around them or happening in their experience that we do as adults, because that beta level of consciousness has not yet fully manifested within the body. That third layer of consciousness, the mental body, it's growing in children, but it's not fully embodied for some time until around 11, 12, 13, something like that. And so sometimes when you mention looking for that moment of corruption, I want to emphasize that, again, just because it's part of the framework of the three-dimensional perspective, is to say, who is responsible for this? And root out the person or the thing or the aspect that is responsible. And when we experience a reality that causes trauma to us, that's where corruption exists. And if you were in a state where you said yes when you really meant no, there is trauma there, right? And you may have made a choice and you may be able to recognize that, but searching that out from my perspective, and not that you were suggesting this, but I just wanted to add it on. It's never about blaming yourself for making the wrong choice, for doing the wrong thing in a certain situation. It's only about recognizing the aspect of yourself that wasn't honored. And
That's right.
when you're talking about being present in the moment, that aspect of yourself is still present now. It's still present when you're going back. It's right now. You don't have to travel back in time. You don't have to so if you have an unconscious trauma, something that happened while you were unconscious, or you were, an infant or something like that, that you don't know about, you can still integrate this honoring into your experience because it is present now. You don't have to have had awareness of it then. You don't even have to know what it is now. As long as you honor that aspect of yourself, you give that aspect the love that you have access to, the best ability that you have to acknowledge, to accept, and to support, then you will be successful in reintegrating that aspect of yourself for full expression. And when we do that process, what happens is those higher aspects of our identity, that involution of your painting, of your beautiful painting, they have space to come down further and be expressed through the lower frequency bands that had not been connected to it previously. So if you go back and you say, you identify this corruption where you had a pattern of saying yes to please other people when you really meant no, that's an aspect of both the emotional body as well as the mental body, where there is corruption in both layers. And you don't have to know that.
Right.
But when you heal that corruption, when you honor the aspect of yourself that was involved with that experience, what happens is the ability for your mental body to understand what happened suddenly permeates that level of your awareness. And if you're able to access love, then those same frequencies of yourself, the part of yourself that responds with truth to opportunities around you, the part of yourself that honors yourself when given the opportunity to make a choice between what's a yes for you and what's a no. Suddenly that loving presence is going to inject itself into you at that level of your experience, and you will love yourself for saying no when it's true.
It's true. I just feel like, John, as you were talking, I could literally feel the grace in the vibrational field. And I feel like you just held the space for the vibration of grace for everyone listening, for all of consciousness. So thank you for that beautiful gift of grace to all of us. It was just magnificent. Thank you so much for that. Well,
as you can see, it's always to receive the acknowledgement of expression of source can be an emotional experience. And when you honor that emotional experience, it creates, just as you were saying, Simone, more space for that grace to come in. It means that I can fully receive that beautiful appreciation that you offered to me. And I can allow that appreciation to permeate my own awareness. That amplifies where you can go next in your own expansion.
Oh, thank you. So we've been on for about an hour. So I'd like to bring this all together for everyone. First off, thanks to everyone who tuned in to listen to this conversation about architecture of the soul. I would really like to thank Bella of Unlock Your Design in 64 Doors and her co-creator, Ashley. If you are enjoying this conversation about architecture of the soul, reach out through the 64 Doors and Unlock Your Design, Bella, who so graciously hosted this conversation. If you'd like more of conversations about architecture of the soul, let Ashley and Bella know. And thank y'all so much. Bella, thank you so much for your genius and, bringing us together for this amazing conversation. I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for all the work that you guys are doing through Living Matrix, 64 Doors, and Unlock Your Design. John, thank you so much. And if you want to connect with John, you can find him at Awakening the Heart and through his teaching of Dynamics of Ascension Science. And we would love to come back maybe if you guys are enjoying this conversation. So for now, it's Simone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.